Elias had always believed breathing was the most ordinary thing a human could do. It happened before thought, before choice, before memory. That night, he lay awake in the dark, listening to the quiet sounds of his room, the low hum of the air, the distant noise of the city, and then his breath, dot in and out, soft, automatic. Out of boredom more than intention, Elias decided to pay attention to it, not to change it, not to control it, just to watch. The moment he did, something shifted. The breath slowed, as if it noticed him noticing it. The chest rose more gently. The exhale stretched longer than before. Elias frowned. That was strange. He remembered something he had once read, a sentence that had stayed with him for years. The observer changes the observed. It was a rule from physics, particles behaving differently when measured, reality responding to attention, but this was his breath. Not an experiment, not a theory. As he continued watching, the space between each inhale and exhale became clearer, wider, almost alive. Thoughts began to fade, not because he pushed them away, but because they lost their grip. His body felt heavier, yet his mind felt light. Then something unsettling happened. No breath no longer felt like something he was doing. It felt like something happening on its own. Worse than that, it felt like something that was aware. A quiet tension formed in his chest. Not fear, exactly. More like surprise. Elias had the sudden feeling that he was no longer the only observer in the room. The idea made no sense, but the sensation was real. He noticed a subtle rhythm beneath the breath, a steady intelligence that did not belong to thought or emotion. It was calm, patient, as if it had always been there. A question surfaced in his mind, slow and clear. If I am watching the breath, who is watching me? His heart beat faster, but the breath stayed calm, almost reassuring. Images from his life floated through his awareness, things he wanted, things he feared, dreams he had been chasing for years. Strangely, none of them felt distant anymore. They felt close, folded into the present moment. It was as if desire itself was not somewhere in the future, but hidden inside. The way he breathed, Elias realized he was not imagining his desires. He was sensing them. They were not thoughts. They were states start, and the breath seemed to move through them effortlessly, without effort or struggle. The more he watched, the less he felt the need to control anything. Time lost its sharp edges. Minutes felt like seconds. Seconds felt like space dot. Then, for a brief moment, the boundary between observer and breath blurred. There was breathing, there was awareness, but no clear sense of a person doing either. Elias felt a quiet awe rise within him. This was not relaxation. It was not meditation as he understood it. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unseen. A doorway. Perhaps as the sensation slowly faded, his thoughts returned louder than before. The room felt solid again. The night felt ordinary. But Elias knew something had changed. He had not learned a new technique. He had not gained control. He had simply observed, and in doing so he had touched something that seemed to observe. Back lying, there in the dark, one thought stayed with him, steady and impossible to ignore. If awareness could change the breath, what else could it change? And what would happen if he kept watching? Elias did not tell anyone what happened that night. Not because he was afraid they would judge him, but because he did not have the words. How could he explain that something as simple as breathing had felt aware? The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. The experience still lingered, not as a memory, but as a quiet pull. Instead of reaching for his phone, Elias sat at the edge of his bed and closed his eyes. He did not try to repeat what had happened. He only returned to the breath, in and out. At first, nothing felt unusual. The breath was shallow. The mind was loud. Thoughts rushed in. Plans, worries, small regrets. But Elias remembered what had worked before. He did not fight them. He simply watched the breath, the same way one might watch waves move across the surface of the ocean. Slowly, something began to change. His shoulders dropped, the jaw softened, the breath deepened without instruction. Elias noticed a pattern he had never seen before. When his thoughts raced, the breath tightened. When he relaxed his attention, the breath opened. It was as if the body was responding not to effort, but to awareness itself. Curious, Elias shifted his attention to different feelings inside him. He thought about a desire he had been carrying for years, a future he wanted, a version of himself he hoped to become. The moment the desire appeared, His breath changed. It became sharp, uneven, almost impatient. Elias was surprised. He had always believed desire lived in the mind, in images, in thoughts, but here it was, written clearly in the body. He let the image fade and returned to watching the breath. The tension softened. A strange realization settled in. Desire was not a problem to solve. It was a signal to observe. Over the next few days, Elias continued this quiet practice. On the bus, before sleep, while waiting in line, he noticed that his breath carried information. Fear made it shallow. Hope made it rush forward. Peace allowed it to move freely. The breath was not just air moving in and out. It was a mirror, and the observer was learning how to read it. One evening, while sitting alone, Elias felt that familiar sense again, the feeling of being watched, not by something outside him, but by something deeper within. A presence that did not judge, did not rush, did not want it, simply noticed. For a brief moment, Elias felt split in two. There was the body breathing, and there was the awareness watching it. But the awareness felt more real than his thoughts, more stable than emotion. It did not change when the breath changed. It remained. This frightened him at first. If he was not his thoughts and not his breath, then what was he? The question echoed, but no answer came. Instead, there was calm. Elias began to understand something subtle. He had spent his life trying to control outcomes, control feelings, control the future. But control was not what created change. Attention was. By observing the breath, he was not forcing the body to relax. He was allowing it to remember how. And if the body responded to awareness so gently, what else might? The idea stayed with him long after he opened his eyes. Maybe the observer was not in the mind. Maybe it lived deeper, inside the body, inside the breath, waiting to be noticed. Elias began to notice a quiet shift in his daily life. It did not arrive suddenly. There was no dramatic moment. No clear line where one way of being ended and another began. Instead, it felt like pressure, slowly releasing. He still had desires. He still wanted things to change. But the feeling behind those wants was different now. Before, desire had felt like leaning forward, always reaching, like holding his breath while waiting for something to arrive. Now, it felt softer. One afternoon, while sitting alone and watching his breath, Elias decided to try something new. Instead of imagining what he wanted in the future, he placed his attention on the breath as it was. No story, no picture, no effort. At first, his mind resisted. It wanted to plan, to hope, to calculate how long things would take. But Elias stayed with the breath, in and out, slowly. A strange feeling emerged. The desire he had been chasing no longer felt distant. It did not feel like a goal. It felt present, not as an image, but as a quiet sense of completeness. This confused him. How could wanting something disappear while still being aware of it? Elias noticed that the moment he stopped chasing the feeling, the body relaxed even more. The breath became smooth, almost effortless. It was as if the body understood something the mind did not. That wanting too tightly was a form of tension, and tension, he realized, was the opposite of receiving. Philosophical ideas he had once read now felt alive. That what you resist persists, that what you grasp slips away. That awareness changes what effort cannot. Elias saw how often he had tried to force life to move faster, to become someone else, to reach some future version of himself, and how exhausting that had been. Now, by simply observing, he felt closer to what he wanted than ever before, not because it had arrived, but because the struggle had ended. Over the next weeks, this pattern repeated itself. Whenever Elias noticed himself wanting something strongly, he returned to the breath, not to make the desire disappear, but to watch how it lived in the body. Each time, the same thing happened. The breath softened, the mind quieted, and the desire loosened its grip. In that space, something unexpected appeared. Trust, not belief, not hope. A calm sense that things did not need to be forced. That reality was already moving. One evening, as Elias sat in silence, a thought passed through him like a whisper. What if desire is not meant to be chased? What if it is meant to be met? He stayed with the breath. The question did not demand an answer. And for the first time, Elias felt no urgency to find one. It was just breathing, just awareness, just presence, and in that presence he felt aligned, not with a future outcome, But with the moment itself, Elias realized then that something important. He had changed. He was no longer trying to bend reality toward him. He was allowing himself to stand still, long enough to notice how reality responded, and it responded quietly, through ease, through timing, through subtle shifts he could not explain. The observer was no longer chasing. He was waiting, and somehow, that waiting felt like the most powerful movement of all. Elias felt a growing need to understand what was happening to him. The experiences no longer felt accidental. They followed patterns, quiet, repeatable patterns. So he began to read, not obsessively, not searching for proof, just curious. Late at night, he read about attention and the brain, how focus shapes perception, how the nervous system responds to what is noticed and what is ignored. One idea stood out. The brain does not react to reality itself. It reacts to what it believes is important. Attention, Elias realized, was not passive, it was creative. In neuroscience, attention strengthened neural pathways. What was noticed grew clearer. What was ignored slowly faded. In physics, observation played a strange role as well. Particles behaved differently when measured. Possibilities collapsed into outcomes. Elias did not pretend to fully understand the math, but the message was clear. Reality responded to observation, and breathing, he now saw, was the perfect bridge. It was physical enough to touch, automatic enough to reveal patterns, and sensitive enough to respond to awareness instantly. When Elias observed the breath, he was training attention without forcing it. He was practicing noticing without demand. That, he realized, might be the key. Most of his life, attention had been tied to effort. Fix this, change that, get somewhere else. But now, attention felt different, gentler, open, and the body responded with trust. One afternoon, Elias tested the idea. He sat quietly and watched. His breath then slowly widened his attention. He noticed the weight of his body on the chair, the sounds in the room, the space behind his eyes. He did not label anything. He only noticed something subtle happened. The sense of being a separate observer softened. There was no strong boundary between inside and outside, just experience unfolding. Elias understood then that attention was not owned by the mind. It was a field, and when that field was relaxed, reality felt less solid, more responsive. He saw how often tension came from narrow focus, from locking onto problems, from replaying the same thoughts again and again. But when attention widened, the grip loosened, the breath flowed, the body settled, and perception shifted. Science described this as regulation. Philosophy described it as presence. Elias felt both were pointing to the same truth. The observer was not meant to control reality. It was meant to meet it clearly. That night, as he lay in bed, watching the breath move on its own, Elias felt a quiet certainty. He was not changing the world by force. He was changing the way the world appeared to him, and that change felt just as real, perhaps more, because reality, he now suspected, was not only shaped by what happened, but by how deeply it was seen. The observer effect was no longer an idea. In a book, it was happening inside his chest. With every breath, Elias did not expect anything unusual to happen that evening. He sat down as he always did, same chair, same quiet room, same gentle attention on the breath, in and out. There was no desire this time, no question, no search for meaning, just breathing. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time felt less important now. As Elias watched the breath, something subtle began to fade. The sense of effort disappeared first. Then the feeling of watching something on purpose. Breathing continued, steady and natural. But the observer felt less clear at first. This made him uneasy. There had always been a sense of me watching the breath, a center, a quiet witness. Now, that center felt thin, like mist. Elias noticed the mind trying to step in, to label, to understand, to regain control. But the moment he noticed that effort, it softened. He returned to simple awareness. Then it happened. There was breathing, there was sensation, there was sound, but there was no clear observer, separate from any of it. No. One standing back experience was simply happening. This frightened him for a brief moment. If there was no observer, then who was aware? The question arose, but it did not stay. It dissolved before it could take shape. What remained was a deep stillness, not empty, not asleep, alive. Elias felt a peace, unlike anything he had known. Not the peace of rest, not the peace of comfort, but the peace of nothing, needing to be different. The breath moved freely. Thoughts appeared and faded without pulling him in. Even the sense of self felt optional, like a story that could be picked up or put down. In this state, desire no longer felt personal. It did not feel like something missing. It felt like movement within the whole, as if life itself was breathing through him. Elias could not tell how long he remained like this. Eventually, the familiar sense of I returned. Softly, without force. The room came back into focus. The body felt solid again, but something fundamental had shifted. The observer no longer felt fixed. It was not a thing, it was a function, something that could appear or disappear depending on attention. Elias understood then why forcing never worked. There was no solid controller inside him, only patterns of attention. And when those patterns relaxed, the illusion of separation relaxed with them. That night, as he prepared for sleep, Elias felt a quiet gratitude, not for an experience, but for the simplicity of it. Nothing had been added, nothing had been achieved, something had simply fallen away, and in its absence, reality felt closer, more intimate, as if he had been standing outside his own life for years, and had finally stepped back in. Elias no longer thought of his practice as something special. It had become part of life. He still breathed, still thought, still wanted things, but his relationship to all of it had changed. When challenges appeared, he noticed the breath first. When desire arose, he watched how it moved through the body. When fear came, he did not push it away. He observed, and that simple act made space. Elias understood now that manifestation was not about pulling reality toward him. It was about removing the tension that pushed it away. The breath had taught him that when breathing was forced, the body resisted. When breathing was observed, the body aligned. Reality, he realized, worked the same way. Awareness was not a command. It was an invitation. By paying attention without demand, Elias had stopped fighting life, and life had responded, quietly. Opportunities appeared without effort. Conversations flowed more easily. Timing felt natural instead of rushed, not because he was controlling outcomes, but because he was no longer blocking them with resistance. Elias saw how often people tried to manifest by wanting harder, by imagining more, by forcing belief, but wanting harder only tightened the breath, and a tight breath could not receive. The observer breath was different. It asked for nothing. It simply noticed. One breath, one observer, not separate, not in conflict, just awareness. Meeting experience. Elias no longer searched for moments where the observer disappeared. He understood now that that would come and go. Sometimes there would be a strong sense of self. Sometimes there would not. Both were fine. What mattered was the gentleness of attention, the honesty of presence. One evening, as Elias walked outside and felt the air move through his lungs, he smiled, not because he had unlocked a secret, but because he had stopped chasing one. He was no longer trying to merge with desire. He was meeting each moment fully, and in doing so, desire no longer felt separate from reality. It felt like part of the same movement, the same breath. The story does not end with Elias, because the observer he discovered was never personal. It is the same awareness, listening now, the same breath, moving quietly in the background, waiting not to be controlled, only to be noticed, and perhaps that is all reality has ever asked for.